This event is brought to you by the Freethinker Institute, which is a not-for-profit looking to increase happiness and decrease harm for members and those we can influence. And then the FTI is focused on transformational personal and professional development for anyone interested. We have these free events on Tuesday evenings where we share knowledge and wisdom with a broad audience. And then we also have a members only community where we actively work to apply wisdom in our personal and professional lives and help each other achieve our goals. So that's a little bit about the FTI. I'm the executive director of the FTI. I'm a software inventor turned entrepreneur whose hobby is writing and discussing practical philosophy, and my desire to do good in the world sort of culminated into founding the FTI. I guess I want to let you, we had a little opening, we were going to give it a little opening, but actually I just want to kind of talk a little bit about the fact that I basically met Greg by attending some of his Stoic meetups, and also including a series of meetups where we applied Stoicism into our daily lives. And I would say the Stoic wisdom that I've learned from Greg has really helped me personally in many aspects of my life, including completely solving my frustration with traffic. I no longer get all frustrated with traffic, which I apply 100% to Greg's credit that he taught me Stoic practical wisdom, which I'm confident he'll talk about, the dichotomy of control, because it's a key aspect of Stoicism. I'm honored to count Greg amongst my philosophy friends and really happy he was able to make time to present tonight. We have a large number of people that RSVP'd, 42 people online now and over 90 RSVPs. So we might get even more. But I do want to say a little bit about Greg. He founded the New York City Stoics in 2013. He's also the co-founder of the Stoic Fellowship. And Ellis has posted the links to these things in the chat if you want to learn more about any one. He's also the co-author of a handbook for new Stoics. And he's on the Modern Stoicism team and will be releasing an intermediate level practical Stoic course at Stoic Missing Pieces. And so I want to thank Ellis for putting all those links in for those that want to learn more. Greg is as you can tell, a Stoic expert, and so we're really happy to have him present tonight. And with that, I'm going to let you, Greg, kind of take it away. I'm also going to make you a host in case you wanted to screen share. Where did you go? There we go. Thanks, Greg, and I'll go ahead and let you take it from here.
All right, sounds good. Thank you for the invite, Garrett, and I am going to attempt to share my screen, and let me know if you can kind of see the presentation. It looks like things are good to go.
Good to go.
All right, so thank you for the invite again, Garrett, and thank you for organizing things and being so on the ball, Alice, in terms of kind of preparation and everything. So today we're going to go over just a broad level overview of Stoicism as a philosophy. And I presume that a lot of people here were attracted to the idea of Stoicism to start, and that's because it's kind of in the cultural milieu nowadays, and you may have heard quite a bit about it, or at least a little bit about it, which is why you came here. But I think in hearing a lot about it, you may be under some misperceptions. And so my goal today is to kind of give a broad overview of Stoicism as a life philosophy and how that differs from other things. So some people may have seen Stoicism and come across it as some kind of life hack, in a sense. For instance, if you want to be more productive or be more resilient, then Stoicism, you can take some tricks from it. But I don't necessarily think that that's a good way to think about Stoicism because, and we'll get into the reason why in a minute, but overall, what one is doing when one is taking it as life hack is taking little bits of Stoicism and applying it to goals that they already have. Some people may also come to Stoicism because of some kind of psychic pain. And one of the missions of the Freethinker Institute is to kind of try to minimize suffering in the world. And some people may want to come to Stoicism in order to do that. But some people are kind of surprised to find out that when I give a presentation on basic Stoicism that the Stoics didn't actually, one of the main goals was not to become, to get rid of one's emotions, not entirely, and certainly not to get rid of emotions because they feel bad. And we'll get into a reason why that is later on. But if people are undergoing diagnosable psychic pain, I think they should probably see therapy, which is a lot more empirically supported, at least a lot of kinds of therapy are, and more targeted to the issues. So I wouldn't say that Stoicism is a therapy either. Instead, I think it's a philosophy of life. And that's different from life hacks in that it's more broad, and it's different from therapies in that it's not specifically targeted just to mental anguish. So, what is a philosophy of life, and what are its uses? Well, overall, I think William Irvine in A Guide to the Good Life kind of put it pretty well in that overall, philosophy of life is meant to be a kind of compass that helps guide where you're going. And the famous philosopher Seneca, one of the Stoic philosophers who you may have heard of before, had a quote that says that if you don't know what port you're sailing to, no wind is favorable. And so, Stoicism and all philosophies of life, from probably Buddhism as well as other Hellenistic philosophies from the early Greek and then Roman periods as well, kind of are different from life hacks in that they are broad reaching and they're supposed to be kind of an overall set of beliefs, ways of thought, and goals to kind of set you where you want to go in life. So it's different from a life hack in that a life hack, you have a problem and you know it's a problem, you have no doubt about that, and you want to solve that problem. That's cool, but that's not really what Stoicism or other life philosophies in general provide. And it's also different from therapy because if you go to a good therapist, unless you're a danger to yourself or others immediately, probably a good therapist will try to get you to align your actions with your life goals, but they won't impose strong values upon you. Philosophy of life are quite different in that you are given a set of values and not really given. So depending on the philosophy, there are actually arguments to be made about the kinds of values that one should have and then make one's life in accordance with those values so that you live a flourishing life overall. So that's the difference between Stoicism as a life philosophy versus life hacks and therapy. So let's go into a little bit of what Stoicism actually is. First of all, it's one of several Hellenistic philosophies, philosophies that arose in the Greek era after the death of Alexander the Great. And there are a whole bunch of different kinds of philosophies, but they all had one goal, which is to find eudaimonia, which is a Greek word that literally means being a state of having a good spirit or having a good spirit beside you. But more figuratively, I think it is best to translate it as crafting a life that's worth living. It's sometimes translated as happiness, which is a little bit of a problematic translation because happiness makes us think of, I'm happy. It's a feeling, an emotion. Whereas eudaimonia was not necessarily such a thing. Although some philosophies thought that some states of feeling did lead to eudaimonia, they are separable things. And you could think about different kinds of life philosophies by cashing them out in terms of how they conceptualized eudaimonia, or a life that's worth living. And all of these philosophies in the Hellenistic era aimed for eudaimonia, but they just didn't agree on what makes a life worth living, a worthwhile life. And so here I'm just giving some examples of other Hellenistic philosophies that you may actually want to explore after learning a bit more about Stoicism and learning that it's not for you. There were the Cyrenaics who wanted to maximize bodily pleasure and thought that a worthwhile life had the maximum amount of bodily pleasure. That doesn't mean that they were all sex, drugs, and rock and roll, though, because they realized that in order to maximize bodily pleasure, you needed to sometimes undergo some pain and also not overindulge, which could lead to pain down the road. So they were kind of what you would call rational hedonists. The Epicureans were also hedonists of a sort, but they thought that the goal of life and a life worth living was to minimize mental pain, which in itself they thought was the highest pleasure. And I think this has, somebody said during the introduction period that Stoicism has some relationship to Buddhism. I see some vague similarities, but also I think they're quite different. And overall, I would say early Buddhism a little more akin to Epicureanism than Stoicism, because they both wanted to minimize mental pain and reduce suffering. And they also had a similar idea that the absence of certain mental states is actually the highest pleasure. That's something that the Epicureans shared. In fact, if you go to a YouTube channel called Doug's Dharma by an acquaintance of mine who focuses on early Buddhism, one of his latest videos is actually on Buddhism and pleasure, and he brings it up and compares the Epicureans to Buddhism. And I think that's a more apt analogy than Stoicism and Buddhism. Another Hellenistic philosophy were the Pyrrhonian skeptics, who thought that a life worth living was to not hold any beliefs strongly because they were baseless as well as causing mental suffering overall. Then there were the Aristotelians, who were sometimes called the Peripatetics later on because they literally walked around in the early days as they spoke, peripatetic, walking around. And they thought that being an excellent human being or virtuous was the most important thing in life, but you also needed a lot of external things that came down to luck, and you couldn't have a worthwhile life if you didn't have some luck. And then finally, there were the Stoics, who thought that virtue or human excellence is all you need. So let me go into this virtue thing because I've been saying virtue and human excellence, and this is a word that is can be misunderstood if one doesn't kind of dig in a little more deeply. So Stoicism, the life philosophy, is meant to kind of have you lead a virtuous life, but virtue has a lot of connotations in our kind of Christianized modern world that came from, in part, the Victorian era England and even a lot before that, where virtue kind of brings up ideas of being prim and proper and saving yourself, not having sex before marriage and that kind of stuff. And that's not what virtue really meant in early Stoicism. Virtue is a translation of the Greek word arete, which really means excellence. And you can have excellent things of all sorts. So here's a bread knife, for instance, and in Greek, it wouldn't be crazy to say that you could have an arete bread knife. Such a knife would not rust, be relatively sharp, but also have serrated edges. And so that would make like for an excellent knife, and if its handle fell off, it would make an excellent knife because part of the thing of being a knife is to have a handle to hold it so you could use it. And it's a little weird to say that the knife is virtuous. And that's why virtue is a weird translation. And so when you think of Stoicism saying virtue is the aim of life, it's really to become excellent. And we're going to get in a little more of what that means. And this may seem a little alien, but we seem to have something built into us that allows us to detect excellent examples of things and not excellent examples of things. So for instance, this plant, if you look at it for a minute, the one on the left is probably a more healthy, excellent, flourishing plant. It has plump leaves. It's not wilting, whereas the one on the right is wilting and drooping. And so we know what plants are. We know what good examples of them, healthy examples of them are. And we kind of knew that almost naturally without thinking about it. And similar with a lot of inanimate objects like knives that we have in the world. We know what makes a good example of something and what doesn't. And so Stoicism wants us to become excellent human beings, and they dig into what that means. So how does one become an excellent human being? An excellent knife will be sharp and not rust. Excellent plant will have plump leaves and grow well. An excellent human being consists of four traits that the ancient Greeks kind of all circled around, and these are all character traits. The first one is practical wisdom, which is the ability to apply one's rationality to know what's really good and worth pursuing and what's not. The second is justice, which is the ability to give people their fair due, no matter what is going on, and also to be able to judge what is fair or not in any given situation. Courage is the ability to use one's reason to think about what's really worth fearing and avoiding, and what's not worth fearing and avoiding. And temperance is the ability to kind of balance all these things and take things in equal measure, not to overdo things or not to underdo things. Now, these four classical virtues are supposedly what make an excellent human being, according to the Stoics. And they could be boiled down to kind of two overall traits. The first is pro-sociality. What that means is that human beings are meant to work together. We do better when we cooperate and help each other out. And so if you throw a human being into a forest and just let them be naked, they're not going to probably do very well for very long. Where hairless apes with bad teeth and not great nails and very little defense otherwise. And so on our own, we don't do well. Every one of us is sitting in front of a computer that we didn't build right now using electricity that we're not generating and may not even know how it's generated, and wearing clothes that we didn't weave, let alone get the fiber for. So a lot of the stuff that we're experiencing right in this moment, right now, is due to human cooperation. And human cooperation is what makes human beings tend to flourish. The second thing is our rationality, and that's the right hand picture. Now, we know in the modern era that animals, to some degree, do have abstract reasoning ability and language and stuff like that, but still, we humans tend to be far and above a lot of other animals in the animal kingdom and a lot of other living creatures. So while dolphins can communicate to a basic degree and octopi can do some basic calculations, as can crows, they know counting and they can make some tools, stuff like that. They still can't make space shuttles. They still can't compose uh, iambic pentameter. They still can't compose symphonies or um, go to the moon. So that is something that are all those are things that are all fruits of human rationality, and we tend to excel at those. So what makes an excellent human being is being as pro-social and as rational as possible. And that those are the set that's the compass, that is the destination point, the port that stoicism wants to sail to in order to become an excellent human being. And it takes the shape of practical wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance, but these are all applying our rationality around human and interacting with other people and things in the world. And that's what Stoicism as a life philosophy really boils down to. So in ancient times, the Stoics tried to train to become a Stoic, at least for a lot of their history. Maybe not all of it, but even then, I think they did. And they studied three classical topics. They had kind of um, a liberal arts education, so to speak. And the first topic that Stoics study is the topic of logic. And logic is a little bit more of a broad topic than what we would say nowadays. It included things like music and poetry, as well as rhetoric, what we would call philosophy of language, as well as formal logic, which is what they would call dialectic. But all of that was a subset of that. Stoics would also cover physics, which is really just natural studies overall. Physis is nature, that's all that is. And so you would study astronomy, geometry, and things like that as well. And finally, what most people know Stoicism for is the ethics, how to cultivate character. And all three of these topics would kind of go together in terms of how to, in terms of Stoic theoretical training. And the Stoics had a simile for how these things all interacted, and they actually thought that you needed all of them in order to have a full Stoic philosophy. If you just focused on the ethics, you're not doing Stoicism. In fact, one of the earliest people who studied with the founder of Stoicism, the founder was named Zeno of Citium, and there was a guy called Aristo who actually thought that you didn't need logic and physics and threw them out. And just studied ethics, and he was known as like a heterodox Stoic and perhaps not a Stoic at all because he dropped that. He said that the founder of Stoicism was wrong. And of course, this is philosophy, not religion, so there can be debate. But in kind of throwing these things out, a lot of people thought that he was not really a Stoic anymore because he threw out two of the three parts of Stoic philosophy. And the first two are not really thought or talked about much in the popular presentations of Stoicism, yet they were important to Stoicism throughout much of their history. We see Marcus Aurelius in the Meditations saying that he studied logic and physics. He says, I'm not very good at them, but he still studied them. Epictetus has a discourse entitled or on why logic is essential to Stoicism. And so even these practical Roman philosophers still actually studied logic and physics to a large degree. Perhaps they withered them a little bit. Physics may not, but even then, physics was important for people who kind of know the background. If you read Marcus Aurelius, he was strongly influenced by how nature works according to the pre-Socratic Heraclitus, and that's physics. If you read Marcus Aurelius' meditations, he actually puts some of his meditations in formal logical form, and you could actually kind of write out the formal logic if you want to. The book by William O. Stevens, Marcus Aurelius, A Guide for the Perplexed, actually does this at points. And in Stoic camp that me and Massimo Pigliucci run once a year in upstate New York, we've done that as well, where we've shown the logical form of Marcus Aurelius's, some of his entries in the Meditations. So it's there if you look for it and if you know what you're looking for. But if you just kind of read it kind of in a cursory manner, you're not going to see it. And that's kind of one of the reasons why I'm kind of giving this talk and giving you a broad overview of Stoicism as a philosophy, because a lot of people don't know about this stuff. But how do these relate to ethics? Well, the Stoics gave a metaphor of a field where logic is the fence that encircles the field, physics is the soil that out of which the crop grows that you want to harvest, and that's ethics. And so I think they had quite a few metaphors, and this is my favorite because it's quite clear. Logic protects the fruit, ethics, from getting overrun or eaten by other animals or just basically destroyed. And so by learning how to reason well, you can cultivate your ethics more. And physics is the soil out of which ethics grows, the crop. And physics, so we have, in order to know how we live an excellent life and a life worth living, we have to know what life and the world is like in the first place. And so that's why they had that metaphor. But this is just a theory. How does one actually become a Stoic? Well, the Roman Stoic teacher Epictetus, who was mentioned during our introductions, created a form of Stoic training that involves 3 disciplines in which you train. The first discipline was called by the scholar Pierre Hadot later. Epictetus actually didn't name them, but they are pretty decent names. Epictetus called them the first, second, and third areas of training. But we call them nowadays, thanks to Pierre Hadot, the discipline of desire and aversion, which is the first one. And here's Epictetus's words about what the purpose of this discipline is, this first area of actual Stoic training after one does the basic theory. The most important and most urgent discipline is that which is concerned with the passions, for these arise in no other way than through our being frustrated in our desires and falling into what we want to avoid. This is what brings about disturbances, confusions, misfortunes, and calamities, and causes sorrow, lamentation, and envy, making people envious and jealous, with the result that we become incapable of listening to reason. And this is, if you kind of read it carefully, this is a little eye-opening in terms of the purpose of Stoicism and what you're trying to do. So this first area of training is what a lot of people actually take to be all of Stoicism, to get the passions under control. But it may come as a surprise. That's all the first step of Stoicism. That's the beginning. That's not the entire philosophy, according to Epictetus's layout. And so he does say it's the most important and urgent, but why does he say that? Well, he says that if we practice the discipline of desire, we'll avoid disturbances, which is kind of what a lot of people want when they come to Stoicism, to feel better. Confusions, which is a little bit of logic there, that we don't necessarily get unclear about how to live one's life as well as the thoughts that go through our head. Misfortunes and calamities, because if you desire for something that isn't going to come about, that isn't up to you, then you're going to be unfortunate by definition. And it causes sorrow, lamentation, and envy. These are emotions. But then Epictetus goes on and says it makes people envious and jealous, with the result that we become incapable of listening to reason. And this is actually the motivation of why Stoics want to get a handle on certain subset of emotions called the passions. We're going to get into what the passions are a little bit later, but they're not all emotions. They're a subset of emotions. And they're a subset of emotions that do 2 things. They make people envious and jealous. That is making people antisocial. And with the result that we become incapable of listening to reason. It makes us less rational. In other words, this subset of emotion, called the passions, not all emotions, just the subset, have 2 characteristic marks. They can make us antisocial and turn against our fellow human beings, and they make us incapable of listening to reason. In other words, and Epictetus actually says this at some points, it makes us literally less human. Because, according to the Stoic theory again, what makes us the best human beings possible is making us as cooperative as possible and also as rational as possible. So this subset of mind states, a subset of emotion called the passions, we don't want to get rid of them because they feel bad. There are passions we actually want to get rid of that feel good, like lust, like righteous anger. Those are passions, and they are to be eliminated ideally in Stoicism, not moderated, not sometimes. You get rid of them. But it's also not all emotions either. And we want to do it not to feel good, but because it makes us antisocial and less reasonable, therefore making us worse human beings, according to the Stoics. So that is the purpose of the discipline of desire, is to eliminate a subset of emotion called the passions to make us better human beings, not to feel better. All right, so that's enough of the theory. So how do you actually practice it? Well, here's one practice from the handbook Enchiridion 2 that Epictetus gives. Remove your aversion, then, from everything that is not within our power, and transfer it to what is contrary to nature among those things that are within our power. This is a fancy way of saying stop giving a crap about what is going on, and stop being afraid of what the outcomes of things will be. And instead, be afraid of the fact that you're afraid of outcomes in the first place. So remove your aversion from everything that is not within our power. So anything that's not completely up to us, and then we try to remove it. Instead, we actually want to become worried about a different thing. And stopped, but I don't know. Okay, it sounds like we're back.
All right, I
So
don't know why that happened.
that's all right. So the goal here is to actually become worried about the fact that we're worried about outcomes. And so that is part of the practice of the discipline of desire, to transfer your aversions from externals to internals. But there's an interesting thing, because this is the discipline of desire and aversion. Aversion is just stuff you want to avoid. Desire is stuff you want to get. It's no big deal, pretty straightforward. Overall, I would put these both in goals. Desire and aversion are both a kind of goal. Desires are things, your goals of what you want to get. Aversions, goals for what you want to avoid. And there's an asymmetry between these, because Epictetus says you want to remove your aversion from externals and put them on internals. But he says something else different about desire. And here's what he says. For the present, however, suppress your desires entirely. For if you desire any of the things that are not within our power, you're bound to be unfortunate, while those that are within our power, which it would be right for you to desire, aren't yet within your reach. And so this is an important point. So we transfer our aversions, what we want to avoid. And Epictetus says, for the present, just suppress your desires entirely. Desires are strong goals of things you want to get. They're not all goals, because he says, use your motives to act or not to act, and even those lightly, with reservations and without straining. And so what he's saying is, yeah, go about your day and do stuff, just don't care about the outcomes too much. And any practice that is in service of these two things, worrying more about what's going on in your head than what's going on outside, and suppressing desires, any practice whatsoever, is within the discipline of desire overall. Epictetus gives us a couple of hints of what to do in the final sentence of the second quote. Use your motives to act or not to act, and even those lightly, with reservations and without straining. And so what he's saying there is that reservations is one of the famous practices of Stoicism called the reserve clause, where whenever you set a goal, like I'm going to have breakfast now, you remind yourself that it could go wrong. maybe there'll be out of your favorite meal, or maybe if you're on the public transportation in New York, maybe it's going to be crowded and you're not going to be able to get on the train, or maybe people are going to be coughing on you and not wearing masks or things like that. Say, I want to get on the train now, but it may not happen, or it may not go the way I want. And secondly, without straining, go for stuff, externals, but just don't put much into it. And that's part of the training of the discipline of desire and aversion. Now, this leads to the second discipline, the discipline of action. And actually, I'm going to go back to this quote for a second, because I wanted to highlight something that Epictetus says in the middle of that second quote, that he says that there's an asymmetry here between aversion and desire, stuff you don't want and what you do want. Epictetus explains this asymmetry by saying that the things that are right for you to desire aren't yet within your reach. And what he's saying there is essentially, what's right for you to desire in terms of Stoicism is becoming a better person. And what Epictetus is implicitly saying here is that if you don't have a handle on your desires and aversions, and therefore your passions, you're not ready for the ethical training of Stoicism yet. And so that's why these exercises and these disciplines build on one another. For the most part, you should get some handle on the desires and aversions, and therefore the passions, that subset of emotions that cause us to be antisocial and anti-rational. And once you do that, then you can move on to desiring what is right for you to desire, which is actually becoming a better person. And that leads into the second discipline, the discipline of action. And here's Epictetus's description of that. The second discipline is concerned with appropriate action. For I shouldn't be unfeeling like a statue, but should preserve my natural and acquired relationships as one who honors the gods, as a son, as a brother, as a father, and as a citizen. And so the gendered language here is because he was talking to possibly aristocrats in training in the Roman era, and they were all men, but we could ignore that from our modern perspective. But what is Epictetus saying here overall? First of all, I want to highlight the fact that he says we should not be unfeeling like a statue. So this gets rid of another Stoic misconception that you're supposed to get a handle on your emotions and suppress them. That's not Stoicism. That is maybe small s Stoicism, how we use the term nowadays. That is not big S Stoicism as a life philosophy. Instead, you work with your emotions, and I'm going to go into a little bit more of Stoic psychology and how you work with them a bit later. But so that's part of the discipline of action. And so, what is the purpose of it? It is acting appropriately. In other words, actually acting morally. Once you've gotten some handle on some passions, then it's the time to go and do ethical training. And you do that through preserving your roles and your relationships. And these Epictetus is listing out here the typical relationships that one would have as a Roman male who is speaking to, but we could definitely substitute in our own relationships, whether it's a worker, a lecturer, and all that kind of stuff. And this all comes down to, again, um, our pro-sociality and our rationality. So we're trying to be ethical and pro-social, and we're doing it in a rational way. We're trying to think about appropriate action and what to do in any given circumstance consistently so that we could fulfill our roles to be the most pro-social that we can be. So how does one actually put that into practice? Well, the basics are through role ethics. And role ethics consists of two phases. You act intentionally, so try not to act out of habit as much as possible, at least within specific domains. And you act intentionally so that you never forsake your human role, which is the highest role of Stoicism. And so you forsake your human role by being anti-rational or being anti-social, and those come about through the passions arising. So you try to work with the passions, try to eliminate them, and that's how you try to fulfill your human role better. And Epictetus had some metaphors for what happens when certain passions arise. He said that instead of acting as a human, people acted as wild beast or sheep. And his metaphor is a wild beast is somebody who gets angry or things like that. And a sheep is somebody who acts passively, just follows the crowd or fulfills their like base desires of like eating good food and relaxing and taking it easy. And so those, if passions arise, they can drive one to become a wild beast or a sheep. And your goal is to kind of work with those so that you fulfill your human roles rather than those other two. And you also have some room to navigate other roles in your life once you fulfill your human roles. Some of them are natural. You can't, for instance, if you were born presumably to a mother, at least a mother, and so that makes you a child of that person if they're still alive. And so by that, that's called a natural relation. And so because of that imposed relationship, you have some obligations to fulfill according to Stoicism. But we also have acquired roles such as jobs we have or relationships we get into and stuff. And that allows us to, and by thinking about things in terms of roles, we're able to deduce what is the most appropriate action. And you deduce them based on 4 criteria. The major criteria that Epictetus provides are the names you bear, which is essentially like who you are in any given moment relative to the people around you. So right now I'm a lecturer, so I'm speaking without stopping. If me and Garrett were sitting down having dinner, I wouldn't have been going on for the past 30 minutes. That would have not fulfilled my role in that case. Now I'm lecturer, so I blah, blah, blah. And also proclivities are the major criteria. If I'm particularly bad at lecturing, then perhaps I should not necessarily think about doing this as much. And I guess you could let me know that at the end. But so you choose your roles in some degree based on what you're good at and also what you're bad at. If I had stage fright, then perhaps I'd want to go back to the discipline of desire and train myself to not be so fearful of that. Then when I'm ready, I can go to public speaking and try to put that into practice for ethical living. But until I'm ready to do that, the passions have too much of a hold, and therefore I probably shouldn't choose to do things related to that. Instead, I should work on the basics if it's a big deal. And if it's not, if I have bigger fish to fry, then I should work on those things within the discipline of desire before moving on to this discipline, the discipline of action. There are also two minor criteria to follow. First are signs from the gods, which is essentially, in Epictetus' time, it was literally like seeing a sign from the gods. Nowadays, we could kind of take this to be having everything externally align so that it seems like it's a good idea to do it because everything's in its place. And also, another minor criteria is do what you want. And I want to emphasize that that is a minor criteria that does not come above the major criteria from the particular roles, which are the names you bear and proclivities, and also definitely does not violate your human role. Your human role always comes above everything. And so that is kind of how to choose how to act in the discipline of action, and this takes years to a lifetime of practice, and it's pretty complicated navigating life thinking about that. But remember, you're trying to act intentionally, and by thinking of things this way, you are rationally and intentionally trying to act throughout your day. But this is pretty complicated, and the scholar Tad Brennan boiled this down to what he called the no tripping rule, which is a little misguiding, but I think if this was also too complicated, it's a good place to start, which is essentially do what you want as long as you don't hurt other people. And that's pretty easy. And he says, like, you could run a race if you want, just don't trip the other runners, you know? So if you wanted, if like this complex framework of role ethics in the discipline of action is too much, you can also just kind of start with the no tripping rule. There are also specific exercises within the discipline of action that you can kind of drill instead. And like we have Mayan Massimo Pigliucci's book, A Handbook for New Stoics, has an entire section on the discipline of action, and we have specific discrete exercises you can drill there if all of that is too much. But this is the discipline of action in its kind of full, most complicated form. And that leads to the third and final discipline that Epictetus laid out, which is called the discipline of assent by Pierre Hadot. And so this is in Epictetus's words. So he says the discipline of assent is the third discipline belongs to those who are already making progress and is concerned with the achievement of constancy in the matters already covered, so that even when we're asleep or drunk or depressed, no untested impressions that presents itself may catch us off guard. And so this is kind of the most advanced form of Stoic training overall, but it again comes back to drilling what we've already covered, prosociality and rationality. And so Epictetus says, like, you're not doing anything new in this final discipline, it's just getting it down really well. But he says some things that are, he brings up some technical Stoic terms here that it may be worth taking some time to go into as an aside. He says, specifically going back, we train ourselves so that no untested impression that presents itself may catch us off guard. So impression, or phantasia in Greek, is a technical term that is used by a lot of Stoics, and it's worth getting into and going over some of the basics of Stoic psychology. So what is an untested impression? So one way Epictetus describes an impression is in one of the more famous quotes by him in the Handbook, chapter 5, where he says, "It isn't the things themselves that disturb people, but the judgments that they form about them. Death, for instance, is nothing terrible, or else it would have seemed so to Socrates too. No, it is the judgment that death is terrible, that the terror lies. So accordingly, whenever we're impeded, disturbed, or distressed, we should never blame anyone else, but only ourselves. That is to say, our judgments." And so what Epictetus is saying here is that things don't disturb people, but judgments about those things disturb people, and judgments go on in your own head. And Epictetus justifies this by saying that if death were something terrible, then everybody would be afraid of it, including Socrates. But he wasn't, so that is proof by contradiction that that stuff doesn't disturb people, but instead their judgments do. And so we could kind of go through a little diagram here to show how Stoics think that emotions arise overall. So first, on the left-hand side, we have this thing called an impression, phantasia in Greek. And these are things that go in on our head, but they're not under our control. They're not up to us. And they're a mix of initial feelings and our quick judgments about the situation, essentially our initial impression about whatever happens to us throughout our day. These things are not up to us, but instead they're grist for the mill of practice. In Stoic psychology, these impressions assail us constantly, and they're presented to our ruling faculty, our frontal cortex, maybe. The hegemonicon is, or the prohoresis, are ways the Greeks said it. And so once we get the initial impression about something, if it thinks that something is terrible and we agree to it, then we may get upset. Otherwise, we won't. And so, for instance, if you're in traffic and some guy cuts you off, that's an initial impression. Not only that, but you may start cursing in your head, saying, ah, fuck, or something like that. Even that's not necessarily up to you at that point. That's part of the impression. A little bit flash of the beginnings of anger along with some automatic thoughts and stuff like that. Where Stoic practice comes in is in the middle, where you could apply rationality, the gears on the left part of the brain, and prosociality, the heart on the right, to say, is me getting upset at this guy, first of all, is that rational? Is it really bad that somebody just cut me off? Um, and am I making judgments about this person without fully knowing them? Perhaps they're on their way to somewhere important. Perhaps they're tired because they've been working really hard and they didn't even see me there. There are a lot of things that could go on that maybe I would have done too. I get tired and don't pay attention on the road sometimes. So why am I upset at this person when I do the same thing? Instead, I should train myself to be better so I'm not like that. That's an example of thinking about the initial impression that I get, which isn't under my control. Even saying that asshole or something out loud, maybe that's the quick first impression of stuff. I could then work with that. But if we agree to it, which happens pretty quickly, that's when all of the other stuff about being disturbed, impeded, and distressed comes in, the upper part of the fork. But if we say, no, wait a minute, I'm not judging the situation correctly, then we can maintain our cool. And that is a practice of this, and by paying close attention to our thoughts, that's what makes this part of the discipline of assent as opposed to the discipline of desire early on, where you kind of train things and take cold showers and do that kind of stuff regularly. Here you're trying to catch things quickly in your head and counteract them. And here's the thing about emotions in Stoicism. So they think that all these big emotions, these passions, are not automatic, but have implicit consent in them, that we assent to our first impressions, and that's what causes the passions. And so we could eliminate the passions by not assenting to these untested impressions. Instead, we test them, put them up to examination, and see whether they actually hold any water. So how do you actually put this into practice? And here's one idea from Epictetus in Enchiridion 1.5. Epictetus says, practice then from the very beginning to say to every disagreeable impression, you are an impression and not at all what you appear to be. Then examine it and test it by these rules that you possess. The first and foremost, this one: whether the impression relates to those things that are within our power or those that aren't within our power. If it relates to anything that isn't within our power, be ready to reply, that's nothing to me. And this itself is is a kind of exercise. And so you could take something that's a disagreeable impression, like somebody cutting you off the road and getting that flash of anger. The goal is to then stop it and say, meh, you're an impression and you may not, this is just a first hypothesis. Okay, let's examine it. Just stop yourself before you go further. And that itself is a hard exercise to do. Once you do that, you're able to hold it up to the rules you possess. Mainly, and the biggest rule in Stoicism is something that a lot of people here probably already know, the Stoic fork, or as Don Robertson calls it, or the dichotomy of control. Is it up to me or is it not? Okay, so the guy cut me off on the road. I got a flash of anger. I say, oh, hold on, am I judging this right? Is this within my control or not? It's not in my power. So then I literally say to the impression, that's nothing to me. It doesn't matter. I can still live a good life without caring about this particular thing. And so what Epictetus is saying is to kind of repeat this over and over again. And that's one way to practice the discipline of assent. But it gets even more hardcore because you could kind of do this a bit at the beginning, but Epictetus says to more advanced students that you should kind of drill it. And here's what he says in Discourses 3.3. As soon as you leave the house at break of day, like when you start your day, examine everyone who you see, everyone whom you hear, and answer as if under questioning. So this is a very rapid fire thing. What did you see? A handsome man or a beautiful woman? So somebody you get attracted to? Apply the rule. What's the rule? Is it up to me? Does this lie within my sphere of choice or outside it? Outside, throw it away. What did you see? Somebody grieving over the death of a child? Apply the rule. Death is something that lies outside the sphere of choice. Away with it. You met an important person? Apply the rule. What kind of thing is importance and praise? One that lies outside the sphere of choice or inside? Outside. Throw it away too. It doesn't stand the test. Away with it. It's nothing to you. So that's him doing it things this what we saw on the previous slide rapidly and repeatedly. If we acted in such a way and practiced this exercise from morning till night, we would then have achieved something by the gods. And so this is an advanced practice that takes a lot of work, and you can tell it's quite straining and requires a lot of attention from the beginning of day till the end. You go away, and for everything you see and every impression that you get, you say, is it up to me, not up to me? And notice how staccato and brief and laconic Epictetus is being here. This is how one would put it into practice. But again, this is an advanced practice for people who've been kind of doing it for a while. So what do I see? Apply the rule. Inside or outside? Outside, away. What did you see? Again and over again. And that's kind of, I think this is a paradigmatic example of how to do the discipline of assent in practice. And so this is overall Epictetus's training program. And it is a program that builds upon itself, starting with the discipline of desire, which is what a lot of people take to be Stoicism to be. Like, that's all Stoicism. But it's not. It's the foundational base. It's the most important. Epictetus says so himself. But it's a base upon which to build a life, a base to build a more ethical life and to become a better human being. And you do that through intentional action and the discipline of action, and then the discipline of assent to cement the practice. Epictetus famously said that he would be happy if he died not a sage. He said he would be happy if he died while practicing the discipline of assent, because then he knows he's near the top. He's almost made it. And this is freaking Epictetus, for crying out loud. So like a lot of people, he seems like a very ethical, respectable guy. But even he said, like, this stuff's hard, and I'd be happy if I died just practicing what he's talked about on the previous slide, let alone becoming a sage. Epictetus also said, I don't need to be a Socrates. I just want to be not a worse Epictetus. And that's an example of role ethics, that he doesn't need to be a Socrates, but he just wants to improve. And I think that's the kind of spirit that a lot of us could possibly benefit from. So that's the basics of the presentation itself. And if you want more information about Stoicism, I have a few different resources for you. And just like role ethics suggests, not all resources are for everybody. So if you're looking for like an easy to read, breezy introduction on how Stoicism can be applied to modern life, I recommend How to Be a Stoic by Massimo Pigliucci, which is kind of a narrative overview of how to apply Epictetus' three disciplines in modern life and how Massimo does it himself. But maybe you're more attracted to psychology and are also more focused on the resilience and emotional regulation aspect. In that case, I would recommend Stoicism and the Art of Happiness by Donald Robertson, who gives a great overview of Stoic theory, but intersperses it with psychological exercises and comes from it from his psychological training, and kind of integrates aspects of modern CBT with Stoicism. Or if you're focused on the ethics, I recommend Being Better, which is a book that applies ethics and Stoic ethics to modern life and things that the Stoics didn't necessarily think about, like environmentalism and animal welfare. Being Better has some great vignettes in it, and also brings some provoking ethical questions about how to be ethical with today's ethical challenges. And finally, if you're interested in just the exercises, if you kind of know the basics of Stoic theory, but like, how do I train? That's the Handbook for New Stoics by Massimo and me. It's not a great introduction if you want to learn the theory of Stoicism, but once you know the theory and you're like, but how do I practice it? This is the book, because it's all exercises where you do things for a week and write out and see whether it worked for you. And you essentially try a bunch of Stoic exercises, keep notes on what worked for you, and then put together your own curriculum at the end of the day. So depending on where you're at and what your interests are, I recommend one of these four to start learning more. So otherwise, that's all I have in terms of the presentation. So now we can finally have some discussion for the next hour, and I'll stop sharing and open the floor.
Great. So if you can raise your hands with questions, and maybe while people are raising their hands, I always look for the loopholes and everything, Greg. So I have a quick loophole question: is You said we were supposed to eliminate lust. I'm sorry, but why do we want to eliminate lust? Why does Stoicism say to eliminate lust? How does that make us antisocial?
Oh, well, I mean, what if you're lusting after your best friend's girl?
Well, certain situations of lust, I definitely agree, but like as a general rule, like ethical lust seems like it should be a-okay. Is that like, is there a distinction made in Stoicism for like okay lust versus, unethical lust?
Yes, well, according to the Stoics, remember that passions push rationality to the side. So if you think you could control lust, there's one of two things going on, or either you're talking about some emotional state that the Stoics would not classify as a passion because it's not pushing reason to the side and you could actually reason. It's not creating its own reasons. You could still think it over. In which case you're not talking about passion, and then that's fine. Or you're the Stoics would say you're simply mistaken in that you think you could control something that pushes you to the side. It's kind of like the meditation instruction. A meditation teacher of mine who I really like, Richard Shankman, has this gotcha question in meditation sessions where he's like, what are the instructions for returning to your breath when you've lost concentration on it? And people are like, oh, you just, gently return, realize it. And he's like, no, that's not the instructions. When you've lost concentration, when you're gone, you're gone. You can't
Yeah.
do anything. You're not there. You're off. You have to simply notice when you come back online. The Stoics would say the same thing about passions. Once a true passion arises, you're not there anymore. And so
Yeah,
you can't moderate passions because they moderate you. That's one of the
right.
defining features. So either the Stoics said would probably say, depending on what you talk about, you're either mistaken or you're not talking about a true passion.
Yeah, I guess I'm more of a time boxer, right? I time box it. And then yeah, I'm not reasonable during that time, but it's time boxed. But anyway, so that said, I want to let Nicholas ask his question. Go ahead, Nicholas. You have your hand up and just go ahead and go off mute to
Uh,
ask your question. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm curious, is there any,
We can hear you.
uh, is there any way of also being able to train yourself through reading the various of the texts of the or the writings of the early Stoics as well?
Training yourself in the readings and writings of the early Stoics?
Yeah.
Yeah, there are a couple of good books. Probably like the Stoics Reader by Brad Inward and Gerstein is probably a pretty good collection of all of the basic Stoic writings together in one place. That is a place to go for the basic Stoic writings. A more advanced version is Long and Sedley's The Hellenistic Philosophers, specifically the Stoic section. They have a lot more commentary, but it's also really hardcore. If you wanted an overview of Stoicism, like as a just a history and stuff, I recommend John Seller's Stoicism, which just is a very nice, readable introduction to Stoic philosophy as a whole.
Great. Thanks, Greg. Will, do you want to ask your question?
Thanks, Garrett. Thanks,
Hey.
Greg. That was excellent. Thank you very much. There was a lot there to digest in half an hour. It was pretty rapid fire. There's something I'm confused with was, so generally speaking, don't pursue things outside your control. And then there was something about and I may have this wrong, but therefore pursue things that are contrary to nature. And what contrary to nature? I was confused with that term. Is
Okay,
that yeah?
yeah, that's roughly what it is. So I'm trying to let's see. I could talk about yeah. Oh yeah, I see it. So remove your aversion then from everything that is not within our power, and transfer it to what is contrary to nature among those things that are within our power. So that's Enchiridion too, if y'all want to write it down and look it up later in different translations of that. Um, so that's what you're doing is you're transferring things to what are contrary to nature among those things that are within your power. So what Epictetus is saying there is contrary to nature, specifically human nature, because the things that are nature that are within your power, you're a human, so that's what you're doing. And what's contrary to nature amongst human beings is not being rational and not being pro-social. And so and essentially, if you're worried about how things are going to turn out, external things, you are worried about something in a way that's contrary to human nature, and also it's contrary to how the world works, how physics works, because we can't control everything that happens. So it's contrary to nature in two senses, that you're wanting something to happen when you can't completely control it. And so you're essentially putting part of your happiness as into the roll of the dice. And you're giving power to other people if they have more power over it than you, or just how things unfold in general. And also, it's contrary to human nature because you're worrying about things in a way that isn't making you less rational because you're not valuing what you can value and what you can control. And also possibly less pro-social because then you'll get angry or anxious, and that's a passion, and it'll make you less human. So in short, it's contrary to human nature, ideal human nature. It's making us less rational and less pro-social. That's what he's saying.
Great,
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just one clarification. Is it true that the Alexander the Great went into Greece at about 300 BC and left half a dozen or a dozen philosophers there and said, stay here for 12 months, learn everything you can, in India, sorry. He didn't invade Greece, it seems he started out there, but he went to India and 300 BC and left 12 philosophers there and said, learn everything you can about the Eastern wisdom. And a lot of Stoicism was born of Buddhist philosophy. Have you heard that?
Sort of. There were philosophers who accompanied Alexander the Great to India, most notably Pyrrho, who founded Pyrrhonian skepticism. I don't recall, though I'm not 100%, I'm not super up on my Alexander, so I don't know if he specifically left philosophers there, but he brought philosophers to India, and he died in like the 320s, I think, so it would have been a couple of decades before Stoicism was founded, which Stoicism was founded around 300. And so as far as whether there's Indian influences, for Stoicism, I don't see many. There's I think there's a book called The Greek Buddha, which makes the hypothesis that Pyrrhonian skepticism was maybe the Greek version of Buddhism, because Pyrrho actually went to with Alexander the Great for a bit. And also, if you go even to the pre-Socratics and Plato, there are some interesting hints that like you see the idea of rebirth and reincarnation appear in some Greek thought, and there may be hints that they're getting this from India, but there's very, very weak to no evidence of it. It's just kind of a looking at the similarity and saying, that's interesting. But there's not great evidence for either way. So I definitely would not bet much, if anything, on that hypothesis, but it's a possibility.
Thank you.
So, and I guess I would argue, I always like to know who is the original person that thought of something, but at the end of the day, like, what matters is, does it add value to our lives, in my opinion. But that said, Prab, your turn.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, so when you say true passions, you might have said that in the, while going through the like slides or whatever, but when you say true passions, what does that mean?
Okay, so passions are a kind of emotion. They're not all emotions, and they're a kind of emotion that the Stoics don't want to moderate, don't want to make a little easier to handle. They wanted to eliminate them. An ideal Stoic would eliminate this subset, not all emotions, but this subset of emotions called passions. Passions have two defining characteristics. If you have an emotion that doesn't meet these two criteria, then it's not a passion. The two defining characteristics are that it makes you rationalize instead of allowing you to be rational. It pushes reason to the side. It makes its own excuses, like anger makes its own excuses. You're going to find a way or reason to hurt people if you're angry. And that's anger making its excuses for you. So that's one of the two criteria that makes an emotion a passion. The second thing is that it has the potential to make you antisocial, to turn against your fellow human beings. And so righteous anger can clearly do that. Greed can do that because you're willing to hurt other people in order to get things. Lust can do that because you're willing to hurt other people in order to get things from them or to get them away from other people. Potentially, not always, but the potential is always there depending on the situation. So a true passion, something that is a passion, is an emotion that makes people antisocial and less rational. And if it is an emotion that does those two things, it's a passion. There are other emotions that don't do one of those two things, then it's an emotion that the Stoics don't want to eliminate. The Stoics still want to have emotion, and but they're just emotions that make you pro-social, or at least don't get in the way of being kinder to others, and also it allows you to preserve your keep your head on straight, allows you to think clearly.
Okay. So it would be like emotions that even if you can have it under control, even if it has the potential to, cause harm to somebody, you just want to eliminate it completely.
Yep, but if you could have it under control, it's not a passion, because a passion, remember, pushes you away. It does its own thing.
Okay, so then like I know I think his name was Gary. He was talking about lust. So you can have lust under control though. So
Yep.
would that be considered not a true passion?
If in the moment you're not, if you think you have it under control in the moment, that it's probably not a passion. Yeah.
Okay. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it.
Yeah, it's a little complicated, but these the founder of Stoicism studied philosophy for 10 years before even beginning to found his own stuff, and then it was built upon over decades. So yeah, it's a big philosophy. It's not just like, hey, take cold showers and you're a Stoic. It's a
Yeah,
little
yeah,
more than that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
If you get anything out of this talk, it's just like, hey, like maybe the Wim Hof method and Stoicism aren't exactly the same thing. So yeah.
Got it.
Great, thanks, Rob. Amber, go ahead.
Hey, thank you. Great lecture. Appreciate it. I'm just curious about the way that the Stoics define how how they define what is and what is not within our control. Because it's easy to say, oh, I don't have direct control over that, so let it go. But there are a lot of things that we don't have direct control over that we do, in fact, have a significant influence on.
Right.
So how do they, parcel that out?
Right. So the harder but more accurate version is that up in our control is a bad translation of the Greek. What Epictetus is literally saying is up to us, not in my control, up to us. And this actually hides a bit of Stoic psychology and physics in it, that Stoics thought that we had complete free will in a certain portion of our brains, and Epictetus called this the prohoresis. And so anything that is up to the prohoresis is up to you. And Epictetus actually in Enchiridion 1 gives a list of the things that are up to us. And they're just certain actions our brain can do. And only a few of them, not everything our brain does, is up to you. Getting a flash of anger, cursing at somebody quickly, having an automatic reaction. Those are all not really up to you. What are up to you are 4 things. He lists them out. Desires, setting goals for what you want to get, like rational goals. Aversions, setting goals for what you want to avoid. Impulses to act, which are just what you want to do. And finally, I guess opinions, like conscious thoughts. Like you could tell yourself, I'm a potato sandwich or something, and you could say that in your head and nothing's going to stop you. So saying conscious words in your head, what you're aiming for in life, goals, desires and aversions, and what you want to do, all those are up to you. Everything else is not up to you. That's kind of the Stoic dichotomy of control. So yeah, and so what's up to you is the goals you set for yourself, what you immediately want to do, and the conscious thoughts you tell yourself. Anything else is not, and that's the basics.
Gotcha. Because there's always a fine line between not responding to things that are perceived to be out of our control versus becoming a little bit of a punching bag because you don't respond to things that are presumably outside of your control.
Right. And so the economy of control is like, it's not great because it kind of encourages that way of thinking, control. Instead, like up to us is more accurate. And so in terms of what you want to do, like the Stoic training is to kind of like become resilient to things that are that are particularly bad parts of your life. But then the second part, the discipline of action, is being ethical. So if you think somebody is an asshole to you and that they have the tendency to be assholes to other people, and you're resilient enough, you could then put yourself in you could then try to intervene. If you're not ready, then and that's kind of what the discipline of action talks about, proclivities, that if you're not ready to handle a specific situation emotionally, then withdraw from it and instead do easier versions of it to get yourself ready maybe one day, if it's a big deal. Um, and or otherwise just remove yourself from it because you're not not in a great place to handle that, and that's perfectly
Right.
fine. So knowing what you can handle and what you can't is a big part of Stoic practice and the discipline of action specifically. Epictetus has this famous example of this slave in the chamber pot, where somebody he gives the example of a slave who's asked to hold the chamber pot for his master, and the question is like, is it the right thing to do to hold the chamber pot? The master threatens him with taking away all his food and beating him a lot. And Epictetus' answer is that there is no single answer. He says there can be somebody who thinks that it's beneath their dignity to do this, and they're happily going to take the beating and being starved for a little bit because there's no way in hell they're going to do something so degrading. That person can take the abuse and have put their dignity over that. But he says then there's somebody who says like, hey, this is not great. I'm like being beaten and stuff. Maybe I'll just hold the chamber pot. And he said that's fine. Essentially, he implies like that's fine too. Like if you're not ready for something, it's better to rationally know you're not and get yourself the hell out of there. So yeah, that's perfectly fine. And Epictetus's only plea, he uses these monetary exchanges a lot, and he says that when people focus on things outside that are not up to them, that are outside their control, they use the maybe not great translation. When people do that, they sell themselves. They're literally giving up their happiness to something that is not up to them. You're essentially saying, here, universe, here, fate, here, this other person who's more powerful than me, take some of my happiness and do what you want with it. And Stoicism's goal is to kind of bring that all in. And Epictetus said, like, these two different people in the same situation, they're both understandable actions. He said, they're, one of them sells themselves, and he's like, but sometimes that's fine. He says, just whatever you do, don't sell yourself for cheap. So if you're gonna get upset about something, get upset about like the possibility of physical violence or like being controlled. That's something that's hard to deal with for everybody, and is probably a good idea for most people to get the hell out and not like sit there and try to take it. And that's not selling yourself for cheap. Getting upset when somebody cuts you off on the highway, that's selling yourself for cheap. Getting upset because somebody gets your drink wrong, the barista gets your drink wrong, that's selling yourself for cheap. So there's a material difference there, and that's Epictetus's plea.
I like that. I like that a lot.
It's a great distinction. Thanks, Greg. SJ.
Garrett, you yourself are muted.
Yeah, sorry, I have a family issue. Can you sort of like, I guess SJ, I was asking if you wanted to go next. I'm gonna try to join from my phone. I have to help my daughter.
Okay, SJ's there. Yep.
Oh, hey, sorry about that. I got disconnected. I was wondering, what are some criticisms of Stoicism that you think are valid, or that Stoicism at least does not address? But I'm not interested in anything that's like from a non-philosophical standpoint. Like I'm not really interested in hearing anything about like from a theologian.
Okay. I guess let's see. There are two of them. At least. One is that the ancient Stoics thought that Stoicism was kind of right for maybe a lot of people because it most fit human nature. Like the human being is rational and pro-social, and because everybody's a human who's attending this talk, presumably, like this is the philosophy to follow. I think their view of human nature is mistaken. I think that you could say a lot of people are a certain way as a statistical norm, but not as deontologic norm that people should be a certain way. And I think the Stoics overstep their bounds there. That's a fancy way of saying that I don't think there's any way to argue. Like if you think that if you don't want to become an excellent human being, you could choose another philosophy and like pursue pleasure or something like that. And I don't think there's any rational way to critique that choice. And so if you want to be a Cyrenaic or an Epicurean, I don't think there's any reason to say be a Stoic instead of an Epicurean, unless your goal is like you want to like cultivate like these excellent character traits, and then stoicism's the way to go. But I'd also say if you're pursuing stoicism but you really care about mental tranquility more, you're actually maybe pursuing the wrong life philosophy, and you should choose something else if you want to cultivate mental tranquility. Because the early training in stoicism, as well as some of the middle and the late, involve putting yourself in uncomfortable situations and being uncomfortable intentionally. You're actually going to minimize the amount of pleasure and boost the amount of, not minimize, but reduce the amount of pleasure and boost the amount of pain in your life if you practice stoicism. Because stoicism is not about pleasure and pain. If you want to pursue a philosophy of life and go in a different direction of the compass, in order to pursue a different life philosophy, then choose Epicureanism, Cyrenaicism, or lots of others depending on your values. And I don't think there's any rational way to critique the values. The Stoics would think that, the ancient ones would. I disagree. A second thing that I would disagree with them on is there's a journalist and occasional on and off Stoic, Jules Evans, and he gave an interesting critique of Stoicism that I call the argument from dance. That I think the Stoics miss something fundamental about how a lot of humans behave and flourish, that they miss, which is ecstatic experiences. That yes, we're rational, and yes, we're pro-social. I think they got those things roughly right. But we also do something else that a lot of living things don't seem to do, which is like participate in weird ecstatic experiences like dance and music and stuff like that. And I think the Stoics miss out on a pretty large part of human life and human flourishing by ignoring that. So the argument against dance is the argument through dance is one of my favorite critiques of Stoicism. And I think modern Stoics would do well to take a little bit more of that in a controlled way. There's a difference between ecstaticism through like dance and then being able to turn it off versus like just mega dosing on LSD all the time. That's maybe not a good practice. At least if you want to be a Stoic and maintain your rationality the entire time. Although the perfect Stoic would be able to do that, because Epictetus, we saw in that quote, said if you practice the discipline of assent enough, you'll even be able to hold your rationality when drunk. And there are similar things, but that's a far ways off for me and maybe others. So like, maybe don't do that as much, but dance and music and communal experiences, even ritual, I think the Stoics missed out on that a little bit, and I'd like to see more of that.
I'm going to try to make an argument, Greg, at some point that increasing happiness and decreasing harm is the right answer, but which I think aligns very well with a lot of Stoicism, although you can disagree with me when time permits if you want. But I want to let Joseph go for now. So Joseph, what's your question?
Hi, Greg. Thanks for joining us. You kind of already answered my question in a way, but I've been reading a lot about REBT and CBT, which obviously Stoicism serves as a foundation for many of them. But I'm also finding that a lot of Epicureanism in REBT specifically. And I was kind of wondering, aside from the obvious difference that the goal is virtue versus pleasure, what are some of the main differences between Epicureanism and Stoicism outside of that obvious goal?
Well, the obvious goal leads to very different lifestyles. I mean, the ancient Stoics were involved in politics and trying to change the world, and that's a big thing. That's a difference. That, if people kind of think about the dichotomy of control, and the Stoics should kind of be punching bags and retreat, the exact opposite is the case. And if that's something that's kind of still sticking in your mind, I'll leave it as an exercise to kind of think about why Marcus Aurelius didn't run away from being emperor, and Seneca tried to tutor Nero, even though Nero was going clearly turning bad, and he only kind of withdrew at the end, or why Cato the Younger fought against Julius Caesar and then committed suicide so he wouldn't be a political pawn. Like, this is not the philosophy of somebody who wants to withdraw from the world and be a punching bag. And so if that's a little bit of a confusion for you, as an aside, think about it a little, write about it a little, and based on what we've discussed today, and think about why the ancient Stoics were not punching bags, and try to harmonize that with the dichotomy of control. But going back to the point, the Stoics are out in the world doing stuff for the most part. The Epicureans got a place in the suburbs, grew their own food, had a little tight-knit community, and talked about philosophy all day. They withdrew. Epicurus allowed for political involvement when you absolutely needed to, or if you would actually be in pain, mental pain, if you were not involved. He thought that some people actually wanted to be in politics, and so like if they went through and did the typical Epicurean thing, they'd actually have not have mental tranquility. For so those small subset of people go into politics, but the typical Epicurean should move out, form their own little micro community, eat bread, and discuss philosophy all day. Very different ways of life, and I think that is probably the biggest way to demonstrate how different these philosophies are. Moving into a small commune and living a simple life versus going out there and fighting for a better world, in a sense. So that in itself, I could go into a lot of technical details about how they're different. The Epicureans were much more, they had different physical views of the world, atomism versus materialism of the Stoics. Like that's different, but that's an ancient thing that doesn't matter too much anymore. The Epicureans threw out a lot of rationality, whereas they thought they were highly empiricist. They thought that you would be able to tell what's true just by paying attention to the facts and not doing rationality too much. This led Epicurus to the famous mistake he was mocked of, even in ancient times, of thinking that the moon was this big, because your senses could not deceive you because the moon's that big in the sky. And so why do you need to do geometry, all this fancy math, to tell you that the moon's actually bigger than it is? It's clearly that big, so duh. So Epicurus thought that, and maybe most importantly in terms of ethics and a mix of logic and ethics to some degree, the Epicureans thought that the pleasure and pain that goes, pleasure and pain is a guide to what's natural. And the Epicurean would say to the Stoic that the Stoics are foolish because humans have this built-in. The Epicureans wanted to live according to nature like the Stoics did to some degree as well, but they would say that the Stoics misunderstood nature because humans have this built-in thing to sense what's good and bad. It's called pleasure and pain. Stoics are stupid for ignoring that kind of thing. Why would you ignore your inbuilt goodness and badness sensor? That's foolish, so don't do it. And that's what led this Epicureans to avoid politics, only hang out with people they like. They minimize their desires so that it's easy to satisfy them and stuff like that. That's a huge. There's several differences between them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. David, why don't you ask your question?
Yeah, can y'all hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, actually, a lot of what George, I believe he just said, it really kind of addressed what I was wanting to ask. But so my understanding of Stoicism is pretty minimal. When I was first exposed to it, and when I first took a philosophy class, my immediate response to it was just a little turned off, and I was Epicureanism kind of appealed more to me, and some of the rhetoric I've seen on the internet about Stoicism, like it's definitely a turn off, but I suppose it isn't representative of actual Stoicism. But I guess what I really wanted to ask, and I don't know if this is a valid question, you were saying, you can't really argue with values from a Stoic standpoint. It sounded like you had addressed that, but I wonder if Stoicism, isn't necessarily a philosophy that promotes a lifestyle that minimizes suffering or promotes, altruism to the highest degree or maximizes happiness, or even necessarily, it isn't Buddhism. It is it's not necessarily a philosophy that cultivates, peace and neutrality to the highest degree. So what really is the key edge or advantage to a Stoic lifestyle that all those other kind of competing philosophies offer?
In a nutshell, like to give like a single sentence of what is Stoic philosophy, I usually tell people its goal is to make you the best human and you can be. So that's the goal of Stoicism, to like make you the best human being and the version of yourself that you can be. And that version may not necessarily have as much pleasure as other things. So that's where I say the key difference. I agree with some of what you said, but also like I think the Stoics were actually pretty altruistic at the end of the day. That's pro-sociality, another way of saying it. So I think that they do promote altruism to a large extent.
Well, they weren't utilitarians.
Oh no, they were not utilitarian. Okay. Yeah.
So Ocean, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I really enjoyed it. I appreciate the lecture in the beginning. And I feel like I am the ultimate Stoic. I feel like I'm a professional classical guitarist and very well known in my town. And I feel like I last 20 or 30 years gave up all the life all the pleasures. And I feel like I'm in a maximum security prison in order to pursue discipline. And I'm one of those few people who is not distracted by lust and those kind of passions. Some people think I'm emotionless, like a robot, and I'm proud of it. And okay, having said, I disagree, and okay, and I agree about the ethics. I'm for me, achieving the goal, artistic goal, is more important than having the pleasure or having happiness. So becoming happy human being is like the bottom of my priority, and whereas achieving my goal is more important at any cost. So I can give up all the life of pleasure, and while sometimes when we are preparing for the music shows, like woman who can easily be the Miss America. And all of my band members are so distracted, and they cannot concentrate anymore. They lost them, just one beautiful girl. And I can completely ignore her. I mean, she gives me attention. Some reason some girl tends to give attention to the guy who ignores them. So she gives me complete attention, but I doesn't distract me at all. So I feel like I'm an ultimate Stoic. Having said, I'm not sure I want to have your opinion. I kind of disagree. Maybe you have a wisdom to tell me that the essence is a virtue is to be social or cooperative within a society instead of becoming the antisocial and being rational. During the Third Reich, most people are so social and being a good citizens, and then not being anti-social. And look what happened to World War II. And 2003, majority of the Americans were agreed what the Bush said and the administration said, mainstream media said, and cooperative and very supportive of Iraq war. And I was one of those rebels, minorities, who are completely against the Iraq war. It's an invasive war. And people treat me as an anti-citizen, anti-American, anti-dirt Americans. And look what happens. British Prime Minister acknowledged it's invasive, unlawful war. We killed over 1 million citizens because most of us are cooperative and social, very social and not anti-social enough. And there are countless examples in the world. So I'm not sure being social and cooperative within a society creates the positive result. And second, rationality. I agree, most of all. I think we can talk about it, but minimize it. If you analyze the music of the Bach or Beethoven or any great achievement, it's all perfectly rational. So music is not the basic result of the passion alone. In fact, music is very mathematical in science. But having said, let's say if I was the top of the food chain, like a Bill Gates or some similar to that, or Henry Kissinger, billions of dollars. We're living in a democracy, but not everybody has same kind of a social influence or so making decisions or influence over the American Parliament or government.
Try to finish up.
Okay, sure. And if I see the most severe problem of the humanity today is the overpopulation, and my rational conclusion is to eliminate most of them, what I see as stupid, useless eaters, and that's very destructive for the humanity. So I don't know, being a perfect or rational human being, it constitutes excellent human beings. And thirdly, who's going to tell you have achieved excellent human beings? There's no guru, Stoic gurus tell you have achieved excellence or not. So in a way, it's like a self-congratulatory or an act of psychological masturbation to say, yeah, I'm a excellent human being. I'm a Stoic, because there's no objectively assess whether you have achieved good excellence as a Stoicism. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I think there are three parts there, and I'll try to keep them in mind. The first one going back to pro-sociality and how people can cooperate with regimes and kind of go through stuff and just go follow the crowd. Well, Epictetus would characterize them as sheep. That's not a human being because you are cooperating with a thing that is not taking all of humanity's goal and interest. And the goal is to be pro-social and to do what's best for humanity, not just your in-group. And so in that case, then yeah, they are not necessarily being pro-social if you're cooperating with a regime that is causing harm worldwide to others in the out-group. That being said, nobody's psychic and perfect. And so sometimes you won't know that that's the case. There could be plenty. I mean, for instance, I pay my taxes as a United States citizen, and some of those taxes go to kill people in Yemen. Should I stop paying my taxes? That's an open question because my taxes also go to things that I like. I think there's room for debate and room for ignorance because nobody's omniscient. But just kind of going ahead, like if you know that something is like really causing a lot of harm to humanity as a whole, and you are particularly partaking in it and choose to anyway, then that's a spot against your character to some degree. But even then, let's remember the chamber pot example. If you are just not psychologically ready to put up with the consequences, maybe you could do something less to rebel in quieter ways. If you know yourself well enough to do that, then there's no fault in like saying, hey, I'm not ready to do this. And so that's you know, at least you know where you are and you know yourself to some degree, which is kind of the Delphic Oracle, the Socrates, that kind of thing. Like at least you know what's going on, and that's what Epictetus would kind of say with the role ethics in terms of the chamber pot example. So yeah, there's room for different things. So the second thing is rationality and not rationality not necessarily being great. And so if you rationally think, I guess you should eliminate a bunch of people, I guess the question is like, remember rationality and pro-sociality go hand in hand. And so that may be problematic in terms of forcing your will of whether other people should live on on them or not. And so the Stoics didn't think that these were separable. Like I will coldly calculate that people will be maximized if I eliminate some of them. That going along with that would be going back to the problem in the first thing and cooperating with the Third Reich. And also it's focusing on something that's not really up to you. And that's a key part of role ethics, is taking into account your proclivities. Remember, that was one of the major criteria for selecting and thinking about what you want to do. Are you personally in a position to eliminate all the people you want to eliminate? My guess is you'd make a very small dent, if any. And so wanting that is something that's really not strongly within your power. And unless you have some capabilities that we may need to bring the FBI on that I don't know about, then like focusing on something that is so not up to you is that seems like not actually Stoic rationality. And I forgot what the third thing is.
There's no guru there
no
to
guru.
tell you whether we're excellent human beings or not.
Right. The Stoics thought that the Stoics thought that there was either no perfect human beings or they're extremely rare. And so that answers that question, is that there's no Stoic who claims to have reached the pinnacle. So the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, claimed to become enlightened. Epicurus said he was the Epicurean sage. He reached the pinnacle of Epicurean practice. 0 Stoics in our record claimed that. So Stoicism is about self-improvement and practice and trying to become better and fucking up a whole lot. It is not about becoming the perfect sage. And Seneca has a letter where he actually says that even a sage, he goes into the details I won't go into, but he says even that somebody who becomes a sage may not recognize it because it's hard to see. And so essentially,
instead of sorry to interrupt, but instead of becoming perfect, even if you're making a small increment of improvement, maybe you're not making an improvement. Who can tell you whether you're making small improvement?
It's a mix of others and yourself. Epictetus gives a very simple example. He says, tally how many times you get angry. And he says like, first, if you get angry every day, count it. And then if you get angry every other day, notice that. And then you could like literally use a counter and click. And that's, I think, one of the exercises in the Handbook for New Stoics. And he says, if you reach 30 days without getting angry, then sacrifice an animal to the gods because you are doing really well. So just tallying your passions is one thing you could do.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Ocean.
Great. So I'm curious, Greg, like where does Stoicism diverge from utilitarianism? And I guess I've always interpreted Stoic justice as aligned with utilitarianism, but you said they're not aligned. And I know there are a lot of misunderstandings of utilitarianism. So I'm curious, where you feel like they diverge, and maybe I have a misunderstanding of utilitarianism too, but I have my own way of interpreting it, which is more or less increasing happiness and decreasing harm, net for society as a whole. And so I'm curious where you see those as diverging.
Because you could have this. So utilitarianism is a subset of consequentialism, which is an ethical theory that looks at the consequences of any action in order to determine whether it's good or bad. The Stoics think that that's an incomplete question, as does virtue ethics as a whole. And so you could think of two people, Alan and Bobby, who do the exact same thing in a specific instance, and it creates the same net utility. Alan does it because he cares about making the world better. Bobby does it because he's afraid of being judged for being a bad person and does it. Same utility change, different internal states. The Stoics and a lot of virtue ethics, it's a broad field, but I'll paint with a broad brush. Virtue ethics would say Alan is doing the virtuous thing because he has the right motivations, Bobby does not. And so, yeah, just looking at consequences and the utility from them is an incomplete calculation according to Stoic ethics.
Got it. Yeah, and I guess I would agree with that. So maybe, yeah, worth thinking more about. Thank you. With that said, I'm going to let Elaine go.
All right. Hi. So I'm pretty new to this Stoic
Oh,
topic,
sorry,
but
Elaine had his hand up before you, if you don't mind.
okay.
She can take the question.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. So I am pretty new to the Stoic topic, and I appreciate that you give the lecture. And I just want to have a question to check my understanding. So you mentioned about the untested impression, and my understanding is it means that our emotion begins with our impression, which resulted from our judgment. Did I get it correctly?
The impression comes before the judgment. Impression is just your first impression about things, and you haven't given it any conscious thought yet. And so we get an impression, then we could use our judgment on it. If we choose not to, it's going to lead to emotion or passion. Or if we choose to do it but agree with our initial impression, then we could get a passion out of that. It's impression, which is not up to you at all. They just come at you. It's your first impressions about things. You then use your judgment to work on the impression. And that's pretty much all of Stoic practice in a nutshell. And then hopefully you work with it in a logical way so that you can then mitigate and eliminate the passions. But the passions come after the judgment.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. That's my question.
Thanks.
Elaine, go ahead.
Yeah, first off, thank you for the lecture. Very informative. I guess my question is twofold. One, are the virtues just based off of the earlier Platonian virtues? And two, what exactly would you call a Stoic sage? Is it something like the Bodhisattva, the person that's on the path to Buddhahood, or is it just kind of like an ideal that's unreachable by humans, basically? Thank you.
Yes. So the Stoic sage is a Buddha more than a Bodhisattva. If you're using those analogies, a Bodhisattva is somebody who puts off their enlightenment intentionally to help other beings, but is not completely enlightened, whereas a Buddha has reached full enlightenment. So the sage is a Buddha, a person who has completely completed the Stoic path, and they're the perfect Stoic. And the Stoics thought that they were rare to non-existent. Some of them pointed to some historical figures like Cato the Younger or Socrates as possibly being sages. Zero Stoic philosophers ever claimed being sages themselves. And some of them specifically said, Seneca said, that they're as rare as the rising of the Egyptian phoenix or the Ethiopian phoenix, which is once every 500 years you may get a sage. So pretty rare overall. And can you remind me of the first question again? I'm sorry, I forgot it.
Yeah, so are the Stoic virtues just based off of the Platonian virtues?
Yes, overall, and we don't exactly know where this list of virtues came from, but it was by Plato, and it was generally in the Greek milieu. So yes, they are the standard for virtues that is in just Greek culture at the time, and so they are based off of it. The Stoics didn't invent that list of four.
I see. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for your question, Elaine. Prab.
Yes. So my second question was when the Stoics say, you have to live in accordance with nature, can you go into specifically what that means? And also, in the book Meditations, when Marcus Aurelius says the logos, what does that mean as well?
Okay. So according to nature means essentially two things: living according to how the world works, and how that cashes out is like accepting that you don't have it, you can't completely control everything that goes on. And so if you accept that, you're not going to be upset by it. Seneca has a nice example of life being, or our lives being like we're like dogs tied up to a cart. And we have a choice of either trotting along the cart and going where it goes, or sitting down and being dragged by the cart. And that's how life is and how the world works sometimes. And so it's better to kind of trot along the cart if you can't control where the cart's going, rather than get scraped up and yelp the entire time. So that's part of living in accordance with nature, is living in accordance with the way the world works and accepting that the world is a certain way, instead of shaking your fist at the heavens saying, why does it have to be this way?
Hmm.
So that's part of living in accordance with nature. The other is living in accordance with human nature, being pro-social or altruistic, and being rational. And so that's living in accordance with nature, accepting that the world works the way it works, and spending some cognitive thinking about a little bit how the world works in the first place, and then trying to sharpen your rationality and trying to care more about other people. Those are like the three aspects of living in accordance with nature. For logos, that's a very complicated word. It kind of means, I guess I like thinking about it in a very rough way, but I think it actually covers a lot of its use cases, is ordering. So logos is where logic comes in, which is one of the three ways that three areas of study that the Stoics did. They're kind of liberal arts education. But logic covered a lot of stuff, not just like formal logic as we think of it today. It also covered poetry, rhetoric, philosophy of language, and music theory. And what all those things have in common? Well, they have in common an ordering, that you order sounds with music, or order words with poetry and rhetoric, and things like that. And so logos is a complicated word that means a bunch of different things in different circumstances, but I would probably say that ordering is the best thing. And they thought that the ancient Stoics thought that the universe had a specific ordering to it. Not only that, but that the universe in itself was conscious, that it was an organism into itself, the entire universe, that had a rational component to it, and that's the logos. And the ancient Stoics thought that the special thing about human beings is that we share a part of the logos within us, that our souls, the thing that makes us human, is a small, flabby part of the world, the universe's logos. And the goal of ancient Stoic practice, with this as the foundational physics, was to bring your inner soul in harmony with universal logos through the three things I mentioned in answer to your first question, by accepting that the world works in certain ways and that it's unfolding to its own end that you can't really control much. Secondly, that you care more about people and try to care more about them within your little corner of the world as much as you're able, and to think rationally about the first two things and as clearly as possible. By doing that, you make your flabby soul a lot more strong and buff, and allows you to kind of take the universal eyed view, so to speak. And so that's what the logos is. And the Stoics thought that the logos was God, and that it was also Zeus, and that it's the entire universe. Ancient Stoic physics was pantheistic, in that they thought that the universe was a living being and the universe was God. There's no external God. It's not spooky or spiritual, but that the universe was God. Modern Stoics who don't believe in God or divine logos have some explaining to do in terms of how they can still practice and be Stoics, given that Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and others found this so motivating. I have my own response to that because I'm one of those Stoics, but I'll leave it there.
So are you saying Stoics were actually the first panpsychics, Greg? Is that what I'm hearing?
I don't know if they're the first, but they were early-ish. Yeah.
Okay. I haven't heard of anyone that was panpsychic before that, but maybe there was someone. So David, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, again, you kind of addressed some of the things I wanted to ask. Just to further, I was going to ask a question to further kind of differentiate, Stoic ethics from utilitarianism, because even past just general consequentialism, even some of the practices I've heard encouraged by, what was it, Seneca, who said, every day look your child in the eyes and remind yourself that they may die today. I don't know who that was who wrote that, but that seems to me like, unless there is a probability that this is going to prevent like just a very, very tragic emotional event, in all likelihood, most utilitarians would probably respond with, hey, if that hurts you, if that's putting you and your child in distress, probably generally avoid that unless you have a really good reason to engage in that practice. But now I'm starting to question, really what do Stoics really have an ethical theory, and does it presuppose, this kind of Aristotelian kind of idea of what is a man and how ought a man to act?
Yeah, I mean, they do have a strong ethical theory, and it doesn't presuppose the Aristotelian version. The Stoics and Aristotelians didn't have much communication, or at least to an extent, literature. Like they don't talk. The Stoics don't talk about Aristotelians too much.
It
But
sounds I'm sorry. It sounds to me like it's teleological, like
oh,
man has a purpose and he ought to act such and such a way. And
yep,
I wonder how individual that can be. Like maybe I'm a person who, is not, is very, maybe the term would be non-neurotypical, where I excel in certain areas, but there's like very, like, for instance, maybe socially, I'm very inept. You see what I'm saying? Like maybe I don't thrive in social conditions, and maybe a very asocial life might benefit from it. You know what I'm saying?
yeah. So yeah, I avoided that term, but yes, the Stoics were highly teleological, as were some of the others, and including Aristotle. Even some of the Epicureans, if we're to believe Cicero, who's a little bit of a suspect source, had some teleological reasons for promoting their philosophy. So yeah, this was in the cultural milieu of the time, telos, like everybody having an end and human beings of a specific kind of person. And when I answered a previous question, I mentioned that indirectly that I don't necessarily buy that kind of stuff, but I still think you could be a Stoic anyway for reasons I won't get into. But to answer your question briefly, yes, teleology was a huge part of Stoicism because they thought you were trying to become an ideal human being, and that's a large part of their ethics. But remember that other thing I said, that's the ideal human being. You're trying to be the best human you can be, but also the best you can be. And that's where Epictetus's role ethics come into play, and specifically those proclivities again. No Stoic thought, and Stoics explicitly said in ancient times that even sages would look very different because they're different people. You could still be courageous, but the courage of a soldier is different than the courage of a hospital care worker, who's different than the courage of a fighter, which is different than the courage of an office worker. You could all be courageous, but it's going to look very different because you're different people under different circumstances. So yes, they're teleological about the general human view, and that takes precedence. But how that cashes out depends on who you are and where you are, and so there's a lot of room for individual variation.
I still feel like I'm more of a fan of Epicureanism, but I really need to educate myself more on this. Thank you. This is fascinating.
Thanks,
Yeah,
David.
keep delving, David, because I find the Stoic perspective a lot more convincing than the Epicureans. And I have to remember, I'll let other people ask their questions, and I'll try to make a comment about that later when I recall the exact reasons. But I have a good way of shooting a hole in Epicureanism, but I'm blanking on it right now. So Joseph, go ahead.
Yeah, you basically just answered my question again. It had to do with role ethics, and I'm familiar with like the Heraclean concentric circles, and then everything that falls within that. But I was wondering, like, again, what is our like the how does what if our values don't necessarily correspond with those circles per se? Then is that written in stone with Stoicism, or then yeah, that's
Yeah,
basically.
in short, yeah, all the more problem with your values,
Yeah,
according to the
right.
ancient Stoics. Because remember, yeah, Stoicism's not a life hack. It's not just a couple of practices to get you what you want, because that presumes that what you want is actually valuable. And the Stoics would question that, as would many other life philosophies, not just Stoicism. And Stoicism is not a psychology in that, like, if what you want is mental tranquility, you're already presuming something else. That Stoicism's not fully offering. They're offering it, but they say it's a side effect of what you should actually be pursuing. And so yeah, like that's room for Stoic practice. If you buy the Stoic theory and notice that your actions are not in line with it, all of Stoic practice is trying to get it more in line with it, imperfectly, stuttering up and down with lots of failures. But if you don't even want to reach the Stoic goal, then I would say then like look for a different life philosophy, or don't have a life philosophy. But I think that'll just get you into trouble. I think somebody, although I disagree with the Stoics, that Stoicism like fits the human nature the best, the human telos. I do think that life philosophies would benefit more people, even like if they chose it consciously. So
Great, thanks, Greg. Susie, I'll let you go, and then I'll raise my hand to add my comment that I thought about. Go ahead, Susie.
Yes, thank you, thank you. Yeah, Greg, when you were saying that impression came first, and then you choose to use judgment, then in a logical way, then we eliminated passion. Does passion have a negative meaning in Stoic?
yes, passions are the kinds of emotions that make you a worse human being. So yes, it's a negative thing that you're trying to eliminate.
Well, when you are pursue a goal, right? You don't put passion in it. Then you put all of your effort in it. Then you put your passion in it. Is that a bad thing?
It depends on what you mean by passion. Maybe you're just using a word differently than how the Stoics used it. So maybe not. We'd have to think about what you mean by you putting your passion into something is. If you are passionate about something and you're willing to kill other people or steal from them or be mean to them, then that Stoics would say, yeah, that's not great. If you're passionate about something, meaning you like it and it's not hurting anybody else. Remember the basic kind of no tripping rule that I mentioned. You could go for what you want in Stoicism as long as you don't hurt other people in the process. That's the simplest version of the discipline of action. Yeah.
Oh, so that's what the rationale and the logic comes in. Like think logically and think rationally, right? Yeah, I wanted to know, how different is it from the original Stoic and the modern one? Do you see a lot of difference between the two disciplines?
Yeah, it's a big question. And I mean, first of all, we have to remember that Stoicism itself was a philosophy and people disagreed within it and it evolved over time. So Stoicism wasn't a single thing during its existence and it did change in noticeable ways. But then even in modern days, Stoicism means a lot of things. And the classification, like some people use it as a life hack essentially. And so you use Stoicism, but you also use Wim Hof and you also do a little bit of meditation and all this kind of stuff. And that is kind of not using it as a philosophy. It's like tools for my toolkit, but I know where I want to go in life already, which I guess if you have a coherent view of it, like more power to you. But I do question why you're using a philosophy that assumes certain things about the world that you're just not assuming and you're going doing your own thing. I guess maybe it could have some benefit depending on the specific exercise you choose, but a lot of the exercises do seem to presume something and I wonder exactly what's going on there. So some people are using it as a life hack, but there are two main people who are practicing Stoicism as a philosophy. And also a lot of people kind of use it for psychological stuff. And there are some things in the modern Stoicism movement that I'm not personally very resident with, like people like having like books or essays or stuff on like Stoicism for leadership or something like that. It's like, well, if you're putting Stoicism before leadership, then you already have your goal of I want to be a good leader. But why the hell do you want to be a good leader? Hopefully, to serve mankind because you're in the position of doing so. And if you're not, according to the role ethics, maybe you shouldn't be. I think the world would be better off if more leaders were Stoic, but I wonder whether some leaders want Stoicism for reasons other than to make the world a better place. So there's a question there. In terms of the broad movements, there's secular Stoicism, or where you don't buy a lot of the physics and God stuff, and I'm kind of in that camp. I don't believe in God or anything supernatural. But there are also a bunch of people called traditional Stoics, and I think the website is traditionalstoicism.com. I think it's run by Chris Fisher, where there are a group of Stoics who and they're very old. They're like older than the modern Stoicism movement when it exploded. They came about like in the 90s into the 2000s, if I'm remembering my history correctly. But they believe that you have to believe that the universe is conscious and you have to be a pantheist essentially in order to be a Stoic. Because you look at Epictetus, you look at Marcus Aurelius, and they all have strong motivation. They're passionate in your way, not the the way. They're passionate about Stoicism, and the techniques work for them because they believe they take the cosmological view of the universe unfolding for its own good. And if you could just see things from that perspective, then your passions will melt away. And they're like modern Stoics who don't believe in God. How do you deal with anything? Your philosophy is flaccid because you don't believe this stuff. And I believe there's some dialogue and discussion to be had. I still fall on the side of not believing in God and still think you could be a Stoic, but that's a more complicated discussion.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Greg.
Thanks, Susie.
So if I can put a comment in about Epicureanism versus Stoicism, Epicureanism is minimizing mental harm, but it's not as pro-social, and so you don't really get the synergistic positive benefits of pro-social behavior of people trying to achieve the common goal of justice, in my opinion. And so that's part of why I resonate more with Stoicism. And I guess I sort of see the Stoic values as aligned with increasing happiness, which I define as helping ourselves and others achieve their goals, as well as minimizing harm, which is, commonly thought of as minimizing suffering, but I say it in a different way for a reason, which we can talk about another day. But, for me, like, having the Stoic virtues helps you do those things, and, not having the Stoic virtues often will result in less positive impacts. And so I guess that's why I've always naturally seen utilitarianism aligned with Stoicism, because I see Stoicism as a way of achieving increasing happiness and decreasing harm, and why Epicureanism never resonated with me, because it sort of is self-focused, it seems like, rather than focused on the common good.
Yeah, I mean, you could see it that way. The pushback could be like the historical record shows that Epicureanism, along with Stoicism, flourished for hundreds of years, whereas other philosophies like Cyrenaicism died out relatively quickly. And Cyrenaicism was, remember, like rational hedonism for physical pleasure.
Right.
That died out, but to some degree, to a decent degree. But Epicureanism stayed, and a lot of people loved it. I mean, people, some guy wrote a nice poem to Epicurus on a wall, and he was revered because even though they moved to their own communities, it's not like he didn't write anything down and spread the teaching. So you could kind of see it like Buddhism in that sense, in a very loose sense, in that Epicurean communities, yeah, they went off and did their own thing, but it's not like they kept the secret to themselves. And for 500-ish years, Epicureanism flourished because people dug it and got something out of it.
Yeah, and I'm not against Epicureanism per se, more that, and similar to Buddhism, while Buddhism is a very self-focused philosophy, I get a ton of wisdom out of Buddhism, but I sort of resonate more, and maybe it's my personal sense of self, and culminating in that is I feel more like Stoicism resonates better for me as far as who I am and what I want to do in terms of like doing common good in the world. Rather than just being focused on improving my own life, I want to help improve the lives of others as well. That said, Ellis, did you want to say something?
Yes, it's Ellis. Thank you to everybody. It's about 10 to 9 now. So I was just going to ask Greg if he has any final comments or anything that's come up tonight that he'd like to talk about. I also posted, Greg, all of your links in our chat for everybody, if you wanted to talk about anything new and upcoming for you, or about your community. And then Garrett will close shortly after.
Yeah, I can't really think of anything. Just to let you know, so Stoic season's coming up. So I'm on the team for Modern Stoicism, and Stoicon is coming up, which is a free. It used to be in person, but it is now an online event, and I think the tickets are by donation, if not completely free, or I think a mix. I'm going to put the link to Stoicon tickets in the chat. So that's going to be an online conference if you want to learn more about Stoicism, and also if you want to try to dip your toes into Stoic practice. Stoic Week is coming up as well, which is a free online thing where you're given a free packet of exercises and can try to practice. And you could sign up for Stoic Week at the second link I linked to. So if you want to be a little bit Stoic for a week, Stoic Week is a great way to dip your toes into that. So both Stoicons by donation and can be free, and Stoic Week is completely free. So check those 2 links out and click on them before you leave today if you're interested in learning more.
Cool. Thanks for posting this, Greg. And then I guess anyone have any other questions? And then we'll close out. If there are any last minute questions, we'll close out after that. Yeah, go ahead, Will.
Thanks, Garrett. I just wanted to say, I know it's not a war between Buddhism and Stoicism, but I think huge part of Buddhist philosophy and the theology, if you're into it, which I'm not because I'm agnostic on karma and reincarnation, I don't buy that. But the Buddhist philosophy, a huge part of that is about cultivating compassion for all. And so I wouldn't say, you said that Buddhism is a little bit sort of self-centered, or it's about the individual. Not at all. I disagree with that. But anyway, it's not a war between the two.
Yeah, no, and I see them as very complementary. And I didn't say self-centered, I said self-focused. And that's because most Buddhists are focused on their own path, but there is the path of the Bodhisattva, which is what I see myself on, which is, being reincarnated in an effort, intentionally reincarnated, even if I ever achieve enlightenment, to intentionally be reincarnated to help others. So Buddhism does have a path for, helping everybody. It's just that's not the typical one that people are going down that I've met in Buddhism, but they both exist for sure. And I think there's a huge, Buddhism and Stoicism are the 2 most fertile territories for wisdom that I found in my life. So, I find both of them to be super helpful and super useful, and Buddhists are generally very kind and compassionate people, as are the capital S Stoics, not to be confused with the lower S Stoics who are bathing with the polar bears. That said, Ocean, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm the only person who says things like this, but based on what I hear, such as the teaching of not get angry and restrain yourself and care about other people, love other people, try to improve the society. I see a lot of similarity with Christian ethics, believe it or not. And I'd like to hear what Greg says.
Yeah, so one of the reasons Stoicism may have died is because Christianity, there's back and forth between pagans and Christians, as Christianity rose in the Roman Empire, but Christianity to me from the outside looks like a mix of Judaism, Neoplatonism, and Stoicism, and so part of the reason why Stoicism may have been eaten up is because Christians picked up some of Stoic stuff. And going back to the question of the Logos, remember how the Gospel of John starts. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word is Logos. And they're picking that up. The Logos was a thing before the Stoics, and Heraclitus talked about it a lot, and it was also a thing in the cultural milieu, though the Stoics focused on it quite a lot. And so part of what John is doing there in the Gospel of John is trying to connect Christianity to the cultural milieu of the Greco-Roman world by using the specific term logos. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. But yeah, Christianity to me looks like Neoplatonism plus Stoicism plus Judaism. That covers a lot of it. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
I had to ask how long did it take for Stoicism to be second nature for you guys? It hasn't. I'll let you know when it does. It's hard. I talk about this stuff and I practice it, but I suck at it. But so does everybody else. One of the liberating things about not believing in sages is it gets you off of the kick of how progressed am I? Well, I'm not a sage, and it's not going to happen, and nobody else is. So screw it. Just try to get a little bit better. So yeah.
I will say though that since I met you, Greg, my percentage of waking hours of happiness has gone up quite a bit, from both Stoic and Buddhist wisdom, and applying that to my life. And so, I do think that certain things like the not getting frustrated at traffic, that's now second nature to me, Ida. And certain things like when we form habits using good wisdom, when we deal with those situations again, they become second nature. by conditioning ourselves to use wisdom in those situations. And so it's not all second nature, like it never completely, you have to keep encountering new situations in life and learning and growing. That's part of being the best version of ourselves, which is the first part of the first intention of the Freethinker Institute, is to be the best version of ourselves, seek truth, and be fair. Be fair is aligned with Stoic justice. And so, doesn't always, like, certain situations can, I think, become second nature. At least they have for me, but then other ones I'm still struggling with and learning from. So that said, I want to let Prob go, and then David, and then we're going to close out because it's almost 9 o'clock.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to see if are there any shows on Netflix or Hulu that revolve around Stoicism?
Not to my knowledge. People ask questions about like general entertainment. I know Tom Wolfe's A Man in Full is like actually has a Stoic character in it. Besides that, I don't know. Definitely not explicitly that I'm aware of.
There's loads of discussion, sorry to interrupt, loads of discussion on YouTube. If you just put in the YouTube, you'll be there all day with YouTube.
Great, thanks, Prob. And David, go ahead.
I wonder how far we can push human psychology. Humans have a basic psychology, and here Stoicism, Buddhism, both, particularly, like you're in traffic, somebody cuts you off, you get mad. To not get mad is it more beneficial to have a brief moment of anger, or to kind of try to counteract it, say, no, I must maintain serenity. There's a very funny, I'm just ending on a funny note here. There's a Seinfeld episode where George's father is learning to be more serene. And he has this phrase he uses, serenity now. And then of course, George has this neighborhood guy that's now George's age, but they were growing up together. And he says, sure, it's great to have serenity now, but if you do it too much, you'll have insanity later. And basically my point is, how far can you push human psychology to become Stoic or Buddhist and deny yourself the outlets of emotions? That's the only point I have.
Greg, do you want to respond to that? I know I do, but I'll let you go first.
I wanted to leave it on a Seinfeld note, but I guess I'll poop on it and make the ending worse. The statement implies its own view of psychology, which is called the pneumatic view of psychology, which you have to let your emotions out. Stoicism and Buddhism both have their own complex psychologies, and both of them think that a lot of these emotions occur at different parts in the chain. But Stoicism, remember, a lot of the emotions come after the judgment. So you don't let emotions out, you agree to let them in. And that's a completely different view of psychology, which is right. I think that there could be a lot more empirical research done to see whether Stoicism could be empirically falsified, because I don't know for a fact that any of this really maps onto reality, but I don't think anybody can really do it from their armchair. The best you could do is maybe practice and see it introspectively, both Stoicism and Buddhism, where like the 12 nidanas and thinking about mental fabrications as being part of emotion and desire later on down the chain being a part of it. But they both have their own psychological theories. I presented the basic Stoic one here today, and I don't think it's gospel truth, and I think we don't know that it really is true or even close to reality. But the only way to know that really is through really good psychological research with millions of dollars and several years worth of study. The second best way is to practice deeply or practice regularly, which I've done, and I see some parts of it, but I also disagree with some parts of it, and I won't get into which is which since we're running out of time. But that's the second best thing, is introspection and seeing whether it works and how it works in detail.
I find I get a lot of benefit from cursing the universe and then letting it go.
So David, what I would argue is that what you're referring to is ignoring negativity without, understanding the root causes of it, which is often referred to as toxic positivity. That's the serenity now, and ignoring all the negative things happening to you and just saying like serenity now, and I'm going to ignore those negative things. And then they're going to keep coming at you because you haven't figured out why they're coming at you. We're going to have another night where we talk about emotions, where I'll try to argue, and I'm curious if this aligns with Stoic philosophy or not. But like when I thought about the question of like, are emotions irrational and like how to deal with emotions, I really try to think about what are the root causes of emotions and look at the root causes of positive emotions and try to cultivate those root causes, and look at the root causes of negative emotions and try to avoid the root causes of the negative emotions so that those negative emotions never come about in the first place. And so that's where, I've kind of no longer get frustrated at traffic, because I looked at, traffic is out of my control. That the root cause was that I was just being angry at the perception that this person in front of me somehow could move faster than they were. And that was completely irrational. And when I realized none of them can do anything about the fact that we're stuck in traffic either, and neither can I, so let's just not worry about it. That's a case where serenity now makes sense. And like, no one can do anything about the traffic that I'm in. Now, there might be one thing I could do, which is reroute, but I always use Waze, and so I reroute based on traffic anyway. So I know I've already done what I can to avoid the traffic. So at that point, it's out of my control, and I don't worry about it anymore. And I just focus on enjoying the ride and open the window. So that said, I just want to kind of close things out, and I want to thank everybody for the great comments and questions. Especially want to thank Greg for coming tonight. Really appreciate your lecture and your answers, really insightful. And thanks again for everyone for joining. I do want to mention our upcoming events, which let me pull up. We have next week, we're going to have Jeffrey talking about knowing yourself. And then the following week, we're going to talk about, should bribery be legal? And did you know that it is? Because it is actually technically legal right now in America. Bribery, yes, bribery of all public officials in terms of politicians and judges, which is something that we'll talk about whether or not it should be legal or not. And listen to, what might sound like a counter, we may go like, well, why should bribery ever be legal? But let's talk about it, and let's listen to the people who think that it should be legal, and with an open mind, and see if there's any good arguments, and talk about how this came about. And then on November 1st, we'll talk about to vaccinate or not to vaccinate. And again, I want to hear all perspectives of people that think we should and should not vaccinate, and the pros and cons of doing it and not doing it. And we'll do a statistical evaluation of the game theory of vaccinating and not vaccinating in different situations. And so those are the next couple of weeks of events. Also want to encourage people to join the online community and stay in touch between these events on Tuesday evenings. Would love to chat with you guys there. And thanks everyone for coming, and again for all your contributions. Hope everybody has a great night, and hope to see you all next week. I won't be here next week. I have a conflict, but Jeff is going to do a great job hosting, and I'll be here again after that. So
Thank you, Garrett.
Thank you, Garrett.
thanks
Thank
a lot,
you.
everybody.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Greg.
Thank you, Greg.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Greg.
Bye all.
Bye-bye.